Hello and welcome to another video and podcast from fantasyfootballscout.co.uk. My name is David and today we're going to have a look at one of the hot talking points of the week, which is of course what to do with Bryan Mbeumo of Brentford, who is already losing managers at quite an alarming rate. At the time of recording, he's the fourth most sold FPL asset for Gameweek 8, having lost 159,000 of the managers that hoped he'd get something in Gameweek 7 and watched him blank once again. Now, he was highly owned at the beginning of the season, continues to be fairly well owned, to be honest, because of the money a lot of us have made off him. It's quite difficult to sell players like that in those situations, and so with a few wildcards hanging about, it very much is a big topic this week. Do we hold or do we sell Bryan Mbeumo? And I'm someone who also is in that boat as well. I've had him since game week 1, and I want to know what is the best course of action to do with him. So I've spent the last few hours going over some key numbers for him over the last couple of weeks. There's all number of factors, to be honest, that impact his ability to score FPL points at the moment. We're going to delve into some of those in some detail now, and hopefully that's going to help you guys come to the best decision for your team in terms of what to do with him. Now, as ever, the information that I have perused this morning has come from the Fantasy Football Scout members area, and of course, if you want the ability to go and do some of these little case studies by yourself without having to rely on the editorial and video schedule of Fantasy Football Scout, then one of the best ways to, of course, do that is to get your own membership. You can sign up now and still get that 30% pre-season price discount if you get yourself sorted as soon as you can. And of course, we've got the Gameweek 8 deadline coming up on Saturday. Still plenty of time for you to assess some of those key 50-50 calls you've got on your team, or perhaps in your wildcard, ahead of the upcoming Gameweek 8 deadline. Now, let's jump straight into the story of Bryan Mbeumo. It's been a very interesting campaign so far for him. Started really, really well. 7 points in Game Week 1 against Spurs, 16 points against Fulham in Game Week 2, a blank against Crystal Palace in Game Week 3, but then back to scoring form in Game Week 4 when he got 8 points against Bournemouth. Ever since then, it's largely been thanks for not trying. We've taken our eyes off that t-shirt and tie combination, unfortunately, and it's become something of a Brian Storm, in the words of the Arctic Monkeys. We've had absolutely no attacking returns in Game Weeks 5, 6 or 7 from Mbeumo. Just 2 points against Newcastle, 1 point against Everton, and 2 against Nottingham Forest. Now, the Newcastle result perhaps wasn't all that disappointing for people. We were probably perhaps expecting fewer points than normal in that game. But for him to go and just get 3 points across 2 games against Everton and Nottingham Forest, that really has pushed him onto the chopping block for a lot of people. However, it's not quite as simple as that. As I said at the beginning, there's a whole number of factors that impact whether or not Mbeumo is someone who is worth having in your FPL team, what his FPL credentials are. And there's a lot of, perhaps, I'm going to suggest, misconceptions about some of the teams that he's faced as well. And so we're going to have a look at some of that now. Now, what I've done is I've taken some information from the Fantasy Football Scout members area and thrown it into a bit of a table of my own so that we can have a look at the journey that he's gone on so far this season in Mbeumo in terms of how often he was shooting, how often he was creating chances from 1 week to the next. So see if we can find some correlation with the points that he was scoring. We've also got XGI in here as well, expected goal involvement. We've got non-penalty expected goal involvement because him being the penalty taker can skew some of the expected goal involvement numbers, for example. And we're also going to have a look at the expected goals conceded, or rather the average expected goals conceded that each of the teams he has faced have recorded so far this season, to see if we can find any kind of correlation. So for the benefit of the podcast listeners, I will talk through some of the numbers on here. So in Game Week 1 against Spurs, we had Mbeumo having 3 shots, 3 in the box, 2 big chances, both of them were on target, an XGI of 1.43 and a non-penalty XGI of 0.64. So fairly solid numbers there, and that translated into 7 points. He didn't create any chances, but he was very much a goal threat player for this particular game. Then the Game Week 2 game against Fulham, 1 chance created. He had the same number of shots, 3, the same number in the box, 3. He had an additional big chance compared to the previous game, so had 3 big chances in this one, and the same number of shots on target, 2. So from an XGI of 2.10 and a non-penalty XGI of 1.31, he scored 16 points. Then against Crystal Palace, he created 2 chances, so a little bit more creative in this game, but interestingly enough, a massive drop-off in actual goal threat potential for this one. So instead of having the customary 3 shots, all of which are in the box, just 1 effort on goal against Palace, 1 in the box, no big chances, no shot on target, 0.29 was his XGI and non-penalty XGI, 2 points. So very much a massive drop-off in his goal threat there, which resulted in a blank. However, back to his good stuff, really, to be honest, against Bournemouth, where he created 2 chances again, but his shots were back up in terms of volume and quality. So 2 shots in total, 2 in the box, 2 big chances and 1 shot on target. XGI of 1.19, and his non-penalty was exactly the same, back up to 8 points. Now, in all of the other games that we've got here, Newcastle, Everton and Nottingham Forest, there's very much one recurring theme here, is that there is a lack of quality chances that he was able to sink his teeth into. A little bit of variation in terms of those shots. So against Newcastle, it was 1 shot. Everton, 3 shots. In Forest, it was 2 shots. And then in terms of those locations, Newcastle, 1 in the box, 2 in the box against Everton, and 2 in the box against Forest. But across those 3 games, just the one big chance when you consider that against Spurs, Fulham and Bournemouth, he managed to, and I suppose if you include the Crystal Palace one as well, between Gameweeks 1 and 4, we can see 7 big chances there, but just 1 in the last 3, and only 1 shot on target as well, compared to 5 in the 4 before that. And so against Newcastle, it was an XGI of 0.06, against Everton, it was 0.44, and against Forest, it was 0.43. So, a lot of information there, I appreciate, but the main thing is that in the last few games, there has been a drop-off in the quality and accuracy of Mbeumo's chances. And the question is, why is that happening? Is that something that needs to trigger a sale, or is it something that's perhaps situational that maybe we hope isn't going to necessarily affect things beyond that? Well, possibly, because the first thing I want to pull out is the average expected goals conceded of the teams that Bryan Mbeumo has faced in the last few weeks, or in the first 7 weeks, I should say, because all of the teams that he got attacking returns against, all 3 of them so far this season have averaged more, or 1.47 expected goals conceded or more this season. All of the teams that he blanked against are below that, which shows that there is an element of fixture difficulty here that has impacted it, and it's the sort of thing that we're only going to notice if we delve into much greater detail, because you look at those fixtures and you think Everton, Forest in particular, and perhaps maybe Crystal Palace are teams that, you know, Mbeumo should be getting goals against. But it's interesting to note that actually Everton and Forest's defence this season hasn't actually been as bad as perhaps we might assume that it is, simply because sometimes we see a team not performing particularly well maybe 6 months ago, and we need to make sure that we're updating how we're assessing a team's ability to achieve a certain thing on the pitch. And so those average expected goals conceded numbers there, as I said, the 3 worst teams of the 7 he's faced so far, Mbeumo scored against all of them. The 4 best teams from those, he didn't score against any of them. Newcastle and Crystal Palace, I suppose, is perhaps not that much of a surprise. But when you saw all 7 Premier League teams so far this season, 4 expected goals conceded, Newcastle have the 3rd best, which, as I said, is not that much of a surprise. Crystal Palace have the 8th best, which, again, is probably not all that much of a surprise. However, Everton's is actually the 7th best. So there's only 6 teams in the Premier League that have actually recorded expected goals conceded at a faster rate than Everton, which just goes to show they're not necessarily a team that should be conceding as many goals as they perhaps have done, because they have conceded 12 goals. So they've underperformed against their XGC by quite a lot. But the point is that defence is not as obliging as you think. And so therefore Mbeumo blanking against them is maybe not quite as alarming as we previously thought that it might be. Nottingham Forest, they're roughly mid-table. Either way, Nottingham Forest and Everton are not in any way your whipping boys that you perhaps maybe expect. Spurs are kind of lower mid-table for their expected goals conceded so far. That's perhaps not surprising when you consider that they play a more risk type of football with the way that they press. And then, of course, Fulham and Bournemouth very much near the bottom. They are the 2nd worst and the 3rd worst team for expected goals conceded so far this season. And we're going to have a look in a minute at who Brentford are facing next and how bad their XGC has been so far this season, to see whether or not there are any opportunities for Mbeumo in the coming weeks to return to the type of football that he was playing against those more favourable opposition earlier in the campaign. But before we do that, we're going to have a look at a few other things, because sometimes what we have in the discussion around Mbeumo is what position he's playing. So I just wanted to cover that briefly in terms of whether or not there has been any formation impact on what he's been able to achieve so far. And what I discovered is that there probably hasn't been any impact on this in terms of the formation. We will talk about personnel in just a second. In the Gameweek 1 game against Spurs, it was a 5-3-2 where Mbeumo played up front. But against Fulham, where he was on the right wing in a 4-3-3, he actually racked up higher expected goal involvement, both in open play and, of course, with the penalty thrown in as well. And so even though he's playing in technically a less central and arguably not as exciting out of position, he still managed to rack up a good XGI score there. 4-3-3 and on the right wing for him was also where he was for the Bournemouth game as well. And just across the course of it, it's exactly what we expect from Brentford. They are playing 4-3-3 in the more winnable games, and then against the so-called top six. So the only times they've played those teams in the Premier League so far this season is Newcastle and Spurs, 5-3-2 both times. However, the 5-3-2 against Spurs, 7 points, XGI of 1.43. In a 5-3-2 against Newcastle, 2 points from an XGI of 0.06. So what you can see there is it's not really the formation that's impacted the difference between those two games, because they've played the same formation in each one. It's just undeniable that Newcastle are a much better defensive asset than Spurs. Alternatively, some big scores out of the 4-3-3, playing on the right wing against your Fulhams and your Bournemouths. However, playing in that exact same position against Crystal Palace, Everton and Nottingham Forest, much lower expected goal involvement and blanks in all of them. So it does look as if we don't have to worry too much about the formation that Brentford are going to play. It is perhaps going to depend a little bit more on the opposition. And we can see that to some extent in having a look at when we compare game weeks 1 to 4 with game weeks 5 to 7 on a more granular level, and with a couple of maps as well. So what we've got on the screen right now is Mbeumo's game weeks 1 to 4 versus Mbeumo game weeks 5 to 7 with a touch map. And yeah, it shows right here that in those games where he's blanked in the last 3, he has been touching the ball less often in the penalty box. So he had 5.6 touches in the penalty box across game weeks 1 through 4 per game, and then per game in game weeks 5 to 7, what we saw from Mbeumo is he's touching the box 4 times per game. So there is, a clear drop off there. Then in terms of the goal attempts, we'll put on an XG shot map up on the screen now. As I said before, it's kind of similar to what I mentioned before with the quality of the chances is really what's dropping. But there is also a drop in volume between those two fixture groups. Between game weeks 1 to 4, and Mbeumo was having 2.2 shots per game, 2.2 of them in the box. In game weeks 5 through 7, 2 shots in the box. 2 shots per game, 1.7 in the box. Then in terms of the quality, he was having 1.5 big chances per game in that first set of fixtures, and then in the most recent 3, 0.3 per game, and then the accuracy from 1.5 per game to 0.3. Shot accuracy is also dropped as a percentage as well, as a sort of raw value from 66.7%, which to be fair is actually very high and sometimes hard to sustain, all the way down to 16.7%. So that just kind of drills home just the gap between those two fixture groups. But as I said, there is definitely an impact on those numbers, I think, from the quality of defensive opponents they're facing, because across those two groups, the average expected goals conceded of the teams that they were facing actually was higher in the first 4 matches compared to the last 3 matches. We'll come on to their upcoming opponents very shortly. Before that, we just need to also talk about something else with Brentford, which is, of course, the injury to their left back, where they've had to change a system where they were playing Aaron Hickey at right back, and then Rico Henry has obviously had to come out of the left back position, so Hickey's moved to left back. And in game week 6 we had Christopher Ayer playing at right back, and then in game week 7 we had Rorslev playing at right back. So behind him, Mbeumo has not necessarily had the usual input from Hickey. He's had 2 different players, and of course losing Henry's output on the left has probably damaged the team a little bit as well. So what I wanted to do was have a look at what impact the loss of Rico Henry has had on Mbeumo, because there are some really interesting things here that I think it's worth being aware of. Because, interestingly enough, despite the fact that in the last 2 matches Mbeumo hasn't got us any attacking returns, he's actually a lot more involved on the ball for Brentford. So between game weeks 1 to 5, so what we're doing now is we're taking that Newcastle game from game week 5, and instead of putting it in the second set of fixtures, we're putting it in the first set of fixtures, because from game week 6 onwards, that's when we've got no Rico Henry. And between these two groups, total touches for Mbeumo went per game went from 45.8 to 72.5. In the opponent's half, it went from 33.6 to 49.5. In the final third, it went from 25.8 to 37.5. Now, admittedly, the touches in the box did drop, but his touches in the final third has seemingly gone up. His passes received has gone up per game in almost every area. Total, opponent's half, final third, we've seen a bump in all three. There's an increase in dribbling from him. There's been an increase in how often he's been trying to take players on. He was trying to take players on 2.2 times per game, game weeks 1 through 5, and 4 per game, game weeks 6 and 7. 2.5 of those were successful. He didn't actually have any successful take-ons in the first 5 game weeks, but in 6 and 7, there we are. He's even losing the ball less often. So between game weeks 1 and 5, he was dispossessed 1.6 times per game. He's now just dispossessed 1.5. And then in terms of how often he's tackled, 3.8 times per game, dropped to 3 per game. So it's really interesting that there have been some improvements in some elements of his performance. It's just they haven't necessarily translated to goals. Perhaps the most interesting one is the distribution change. Now, we have to be aware of the fact that the sample sizes here are a bit skewed, and we've got 5 game weeks on the left and 2 on the right, and of course when it's only 2 game weeks sometimes it's hard to read too much into it, but the gap is interesting, and it's worth being aware of because it does still imply that there is some fantasy potential here. Now for the distribution, I won't bore you with the details in terms of total passes and opponent's half, final third, etc. What I will look at is the crossing and the assist potential specifically. So for crossing, across the first 5 games, Mbeumo was crossing 5.6 times per game. That's gone up to 6 per game in the last 2. Successful crosses has gone from 2.2 per game to 2.5. And then the percentage, obviously, from 39.3 up to 41.7. And then in terms of the assist potential, it's gone from 1 chance created per game in the first 5 matches to 2.5 chances created per game in the last 2. And as I said, whilst you could turn around and say, oh, it's only Everton and Nottingham Forest, well, actually, unfortunately, the defensive data that we've got in front of us, that we've looked at the beginning, suggests that, Everton and Nottingham Forest are not the worst teams that Brentford have faced defensively so far this season. Technically, that's Spurs, Fulham, and Bournemouth. So the fact that there has been an increase in assist potential is definitely worth being aware of. Let's have a look at what it looks like on the map. And when you consider that the right-hand side is 2 matches and the left-hand side is just 1, the fact that we've got a much, much higher concentration of chances created on the right-hand side is very, very telling. And a lot of them are coming from the right-hand side, where, of course, he plays right wing. And it would appear that he is being tasked slightly more with some level of creativity than before, when they had Rico Henry, who obviously would provide it from the other side, but being particularly good fullback at getting forward and creating chances, they did lose some creative element from the team. And so that is obviously going to have some impact on his goal threat, which is definitely there. We can't ignore that. Goal attempts in terms of the quality and the on target, as I said, they have changed. But it is worth pointing out, interestingly enough, that between game weeks 1 through 5 and game weeks 6 and 7, Mbeumo is actually shooting more often. In the first 5 game weeks this season, 2 shots per game. In the last 2, 2.5. The amount in the box has changed, has stayed exactly the same. It's 2 and 2. But he, as I said, 1.2 big chances per game down to 0.5, and then in terms of on target, 1.2 per game to 0.5. So the quality and the accuracy is dropping, but the volume is staying the same. And so I'm hoping, as an Mbeumo owner, that maybe if the quality can, if the volume can stay the same and the quality come back up again, maybe we might see him come back as an asset at some point. One last thing to look at here is, interestingly enough, he's even being more rewarded by the bonus in these games than when he was doing much better, which means that if he does start to get attacking returns again, theoretically, if he continues playing in this style that we've seen in the last 2 games, he's more likely to get bonus. So his BPS baseline bonus points per game in game weeks 1 through 5 was 3.8, and it's gone up to 9 in each of the across the last 2. His BPS pass completion from 0.4 to 3.0. His BPS for clearances, box interceptions from 0.2 to 0.5. Recoveries 0.8 to 2.0. So there are definitely some, in inverted commas, good things that we've seen from Mbeumo statistically over the last couple of games. I know that the eye test has hardly helped because he missed a very big chance against Forest, and that is frustrating. But as I said, in the upcoming weeks, there may be the opportunity for Mbeumo to demonstrate what he's done earlier in the campaign when he does go up against defences that are more obliging than the 3 he's faced in the last 3. As I said, it's very difficult when we look at the numbers in terms of expected goals conceded to necessarily say that Forest and Everton are among some of the more obliging defences out there, because there's just too many other teams that are much more obliging than them, and they sort of hide in plain sight in many ways, because they are, in some cases, teams that have had a good season so far in terms of points, or they might be another top 6 side that perhaps hide in plain sight in terms of their fixture difficulty just because of their name. And of course, the prime example there is probably Manchester United, who over the first 7 matches have averaged an expected goals conceded of 1.61 per game so far this season. That is, of course, let's just bring back the breakdown from before. The teams they were facing, 1.61. That's higher than Spurs, higher than Spurs, and below Fulham and Bournemouth, but much higher than Forest, Everton, Newcastle and Palace so far this season. And so if he can get 7 points against Spurs, we fingers crossed hope that maybe he can deliver on some of those interesting numbers we saw when he plays Man United, because the law of averages does suggest that he is going to get more chances of high quality against a team that is actually in a pretty bad place defensively right now. Now, we've got a couple of other teams in this run who also are particularly bad shape defensively. So far this season, Burnley have averaged 1.9 XGC per game. We've got West Ham, who actually have one of the worst for this particular stat, 2.08 for them. And then in game week 14, Luton 1.96 per game for their expected goals conceded. Now, the tricky ones obviously are Chelsea, Liverpool, Arsenal, which Brentford face in game weeks 10, 12 and 13. Chelsea are 1.07, Liverpool are 1.32, Arsenal 0.88. Much more in the realms of the teams that Mbeumo has blanked against. But, as I said, the teams that Mbeumo has scored against this season have XGC that is either similar or just in a similar or worse situation than the guys they're facing in the next coming weeks. And so because 3 of those 4 teams are in 3 of Brentford's next 4, starts to make me think that maybe I might give him one more chance, in the sense that he's about to face some very favourable opponents. And he's also about to face some favourable opponents when it comes to where these defences are at their weakest. I know that a lot of people like this particular way of looking at teams. So what I thought I'd do, just to finish off, was examine the defences of all these teams and find out where it is that they are giving up as more of their chances. Because, of course, Mbeumo plays on the right-hand side. We're looking for teams that are weaker on the left, because then it just means that not only is Mbeumo going up against a team that has got a worse defence than some of the teams he's blanked against, if he's going up against a side that specifically has issues defending against players in his position, that of course will benefit him as well. And what I discovered was that, thankfully enough, of those 4 teams that we just highlighted on the previous slide, basically all 4 of them are very bad at defending the left-hand side, which is really encouraging. So Man United, they've conceded 25 chances down the left-hand side so far this season. They are the 13th worst for that so far this season. They're admittedly a little bit worse on the right-hand side, but not far off. Burnley have conceded 28 chances down their left-hand side. That is by far and away their worst flank, especially compared to the right. That is the 16th worst in the Premier League. West Ham have conceded 34 chances down their left-hand side. That's more than on their right. And that's the 18th worst left side in the Premier League. Only Wolves and Sheffield United have conceded more chances down their left-hand side than West Ham so far this season. That definitely bodes well for Mbeumo. And then Luton, it's a little bit further off. It's in game week 14, and it's after some of those harder games that Brentford have. So you may have sold him by then anyway. Now I'm going to come on to actionable FPL strategy in a second from this little bit of research. But yeah, with Luton, they've conceded 30 chances down their left-hand side. And the gap between their other areas is phenomenal here. They're the 17th worst side for conceding chances down the left-hand side. Only West Ham, Wolves and Sheffield United are worse there. But they've conceded 16 through the centre. So it's almost double what they've conceded through there. They've conceded 20 down their right-hand side, so it's 8 more than that side. And it's worth pointing out, actually, with Luton and Burnley, despite the fact that they're in very poor places for left-hand side chances conceded. This is just a raw figure, right? This doesn't take into a per game, because that was just a bit too fiddly for me. And I just want to asterisk this with the fact that I'm recording this before Luton versus Burnley on the Tuesday night, the second game of those 2 teams having in double game week 7. So if you're checking this out perhaps on Wednesday, Thursday, then the numbers for Luton and Burnley almost certainly will be worse, and will perhaps just tweak this chart a little bit. So yeah, those 2 teams are very bad at defending down on Mbeumo's side. So I'd like to think that Mbeumo can get something against them. But the question then just become, what do we do with Mbeumo, right? That's what this is all about. What does it mean for that transfer strategy? Well, I think when you look at those games that we've got coming up, it makes me think that I'd like to see if I can hold Mbeumo to maybe give him the best chance to benefit from these defences that don't look particularly strong. They do look very obliging, and in some cases very much with a specific focus on his area of the pitch. He's got 3 of those in the next 4. The Chelsea game is of course, the exception there, but I feel like there's maybe enough for me to give Mbeumo 3 of the next 4. And if he perhaps after the first 2 has done nothing, then it then becomes only 2 of the next 5 does he have games against these teams with more obliging defences specifically focused on his area of the pitch, and maybe that's when I sell him. Because, that particular set of the fixtures doesn't look very nice at all, and then maybe the stars align for me to perhaps bring him back in for game week 14 when they do face Luton. Alternatively, if I hold him for 3 of the next 4 and he gets me returns against Man United and Burnley, I think I would probably feel like I'd seen enough to hold him through the Chelsea game and hope for the best. Because, of course, one thing we haven't talked about here is he is still on penalties. All it takes is for one of these teams to afford Brentford a penalty, and he's got a very good chance of getting you a goal. So could maybe hope for that against Chelsea, and then I'd feel a lot more comfortable taking him into that West Ham game, and then maybe selling him after that on the view that of 2 of the next 3, they're against much better defences. So that's what I'm thinking with Mbeumo. A lot of it is going to be team dependent. There's going to be midfielders perhaps you want to reach that perhaps you can't unless you sell Mbeumo. But in terms of the best way to assess that, I'm going to do my team selection video later on this week, where I'm going to take a lot of this stuff that I've learned about Mbeumo today and feed that into the specific needs and problems in my team. And that will kind of give me more of an idea about what I'm going to do with him moving forward. Of course, I'm not going to be playing my wild card, so I'm very much still looking at players as best I can at an individual basis and transfers in the same way. So that's my thinking there. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you guys. Appreciate there's a lot of information here, but I think it's a really important subject that we discuss at quite great length this week, because Mbeumo is highly owned. We've got money tied up in him as well, and so if you do sell him and bring him back, you could lose a bit of cash. And this season, the price changes do seem to be affecting team decisions a little bit more, so it's definitely worth staying on top of that. Of course, everything you've seen here has come from the members area as well, so make sure you've signed up for that ahead of the next deadline. 30% discount with those preseason prices still available. So make sure you get that sorted as soon as you can. Well, as I said, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you have, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell notification so you don't miss a thing. And with that, I shall leave you fine folks to enjoy the rest of your FPL tinkering, and I shall see you next time.